Hamilton.
Defying the Law, Friday at 8 on TV.
The day of victory comes when the whistles in 1,000 war plants blow for the last time, and the fighting men come home to work once more in factory and field. Then millions upon millions will seek and will expect to find the opportunities of peace.
General Crerar addresses his 1st Canadian Army.
Victory Day, long last, has arrived. The Canadians who have survived will be returning home to Canada. I believe that the future of Canada rests in their hands. It will be a grand future should they be given the opportunity in peace to prove and practice the admirable characteristics they have demonstrated in war.
Everybody could remember the Depression. Even someone like me who'd been a kid in the Depression could remember it. To the vets, of course, it was, seared into their minds. And so the question when they came home was there going to be a job? And their jobs were protected in the sense that they said, if you've had with a job, you'll get the job back that you had. Big deal. A great many of them hadn't had any jobs. And the jobs they'd had in many cases were lousy. So there was the question of what, in fact, this world that they were returning to was going to be like. And the Hamilton strike was absolutely central to that.
The city of Hamilton is home to much of Canada's industrial empire. Here, the strength, the skill, the minds of many men combine to produce 1,001 products. Goods which have made our age the most productive and the best informed. The great steel industry is the backbone of this industrial giant. Our modern civilization is not built upon steel. It is built upon the men who make steel. Men who live and breathe life into the molten, fiery heart of the metal.
This was the face that Stelco showed the world. Life inside, in the open hearth, blast furnaces, and rolling mills, was very different.
Stelco always regarded themselves as being a pretty righteous and virtuous employer. It was Hugh Hilt, Stelco president, who made me a unionist. Old Huey, as I call him, sent a letter to every employee telling us to leave it to Dad. He'd take care of us. So when I read it, I said to my wife, he's treating me like a little child. I'm going down and joining the union. Reg Gardner.
In some departments of Stelco, if you weren't a member of the Masonic Lodge, you wouldn't be hired. It was the ethnic workers that got the thin edge of the stick. I worked in a department where a new supervisor came in and he removed every non-Anglo-Saxon from key jobs. I found myself unwillingly in a senior position in the mill because of that. I replaced a truly great man, a man named Borkovich. He was a big guy, strong and hard-working and fearful of any kind of supervision. He'd outworked 10 horses on a shift, but he didn't fit the new mold the new department head wanted. Borkovich was the kindest man to me. I did my best to hold up my end, but a 10.5-hour shift in there was murder. This man did everything to help me, and it was just terrible the way I had to take his job. I went into the office, with my hat off, by the way, and I told the superintendent why I didn't want this to happen, and he told me to get back on the job or get the hell out of the plant. John, listen.
So long as the government of the province and the federal government are not subject to control of a foreign power, this company declines to negotiate with any organization with communist associations and supported by U.S. funds in its attempt to secure control over our employees. Hugh Hilton.
On the afternoon of July 14th, 1946, more than 1,000 steelworkers filled this theater in Hamilton's East End, while as many more thronged the streets outside. A number at home slept from the shift just ended, while still others were at work, steelmaking being a 24-hour operation. The speaker who caused those assembled to erupt was from United Steelworkers of America headquarters in Pittsburgh. Their Canadian leaders, Charles Millard and Larry Sefton, also spoke. But it was the featured speaker from the States who persuaded all those present that they were part of the mighty host of the CIO, now freed on both sides of the border from wartime restrictions on strikes, and ready to march. And march they did, straight from the theater to Wilcox Lane, the main gates of Stelco.
We'd no sooner arrived than a car came out of the plant. The car was stopped. The driver was told that if he went out, he could not come back. But 10 minutes later, he returned, demanding to be let through. The car was grabbed by at least 20 burly strikers, picked up and carried towards the ditch. I would have liked to be one of them, but there was no room. Not a square inch of the car remained to be taken hold of. I knew that, but apparently Charlie Millard, a great figure to me, our national director, didn't. He raced around the car twice, trying to find some piece of it to grab so that he could become part of the action. Watching him do that somehow diminished him. Eric Hansen.
The picket line was thrown up 16 hours before the strike was scheduled to start at 7 o'clock a.m. July 15th. But the illegality was trivial, since the strikers were already defying the law. The previous Friday, the plants had been seized by the government, who appointed a controller under the War Measures Act, still in effect.
Under the terms of the order in council, every worker who refuses to follow the controller's direction can be fined $20 a day. Penalties for interfering with the controller, for counseling an employee to refuse to obey the controller, range up to a maximum fine of $5,000 or 5 years in jail, or both.
No one should be fooled. The steel plants have not really been seized by the government. The companies are still operating the mills. The companies are getting the profits, not the people of Canada. Privy Council Order 2901, taking over Stelco and making it illegal for workers to refuse work, contains the fascist principle of forced labor. Charlie Millard, National Director, United Steelworkers of America.
Money and vacations were part of the union's demands, but the fundamental issue was union security. In traditional craft unionism, the company hired only union members. Those who didn't pay dues didn't work. With workers now being organized by plant, union membership was voluntary, and the collection of dues, which the company insisted be done off company property, was a perpetual problem. The union demand was that Stelco deduct members' dues from their paychecks if the member requested it. The company's refusal was seen as an attack on the union. Thus, union security became the fundamental issue in the strike.
This is the showdown fight to determine whether labor in Canada is going to get union security or not. The battle of all Canadian workers against the government limit of 10 cents an hour wage increases and against all companies refusing to grant union security will be fought out in the steel strike, and Hamilton will be the battlefield. Toronto Daily Star.
Mackenzie King, who had allowed his ministers to proceed with the plant seizures, privately confided his misgivings to his diary.
Well, at Sandy Hill, news came of the steel strike. I began to regret that I did not hold out against the appointment of a controller. I accepted what both Howe and Labor Minister Mitchell claimed they felt sure of, that a controller's intervention and the war powers would save the situation. I expressed doubts at the time, but I should have been firm. However, it was meant for the best to take every step that might prevent a strike.
To the extent that I can remember what my reaction was to this order that we would all be jailed and so on, was I was worried that my father might take this seriously. And I wasn't living with my father. I was on my own, but my father was close enough so that I would have to explain to him why I was breaking the law. But I remember having no other anxiety about it. What it was, though, it very clearly, to us, what it meant was that the government had totally taken the company's side, and that these prohibitions were designed, in effect, to destroy the union. Because having gone through a whole war when they weren't allowed to strike, and here the first effort to improve their conditions, and the company had been granted an increase in the price of steel, $5 a ton, I still remember. And yet our wages were frozen at 10 cents increase was the maximum allowed. And here we had a government that said it was illegal to raise our wages more than 10 cents. But it was not illegal to pay people triple time in order to break a strike. So I utterly despised the people who stayed in.
The government control of the plant encouraged Stelco to continue to operate. But if this was to happen, then plans to feed and supply the workers had to be made in advance.
A large stretch of land in the northeast area of the works, beside the water, had been cleared and smoothed down. As the job reached completion, it became clear that the company was not beginning a new construction project as we'd been led to believe. The yard crew discovered they were building an airstrip. Reg Gardner.
A lot of the preparations had been made in anticipation of the men working inside. Trainloads of bedding, of food, refrigerator cars, and everything had been moved in the week before the strike, all with the compliance of the federal government. J.P. Kelly.
Canadian steel capacity was 5 times greater than when the war began. Where was this steel to be sold now that peace had returned? The government was determined the country not slip into a recession as it had immediately after World War I. The memory of the Great Depression of the 1930s was still fresh. Any hint of a return to that could well lead to violence, with returning vets in the vanguard. But industry across Canada was unanimous that they could not be competitive if wages increased significantly. But in 1946, Stelco employees had to work 15 years to earn a week's paid vacation a year, and they worked a 48-hour week without sick leave or other benefits. The war had interrupted a drive to organize North American industrial workers led by John L. Lewis, president of the United Mine Workers and the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which had broken away from the American Federation of Labor to organize workers by industry rather than by skill or craft.
The CIO were considered very dangerous. Many of their organizers were avowed communists. They were unrelenting in their opposition. I mean, even Roosevelt, who had done a great deal to foster the development of unions, couldn't get along with them. Even before I actually joined the union, I was aware of, you know, you might even say the folk elements of the labor movement. Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger, and the songs and the organization down in the States. And this was all this was all because of the CIO. They took on almost a legendary quality. So that in terms of the confidence of those of us who were in the union, the fact that out there somewhere was this great force working on our behalf, I think fostered our militancy.
If John L. Lewis was the hidden hand behind the fear engendered by the CIO, C.D. Howe, the equally implacable architect of much of Canada's new industry, was that for the government and consequently for the company. But Mackenzie King had already begun to change course.
I strongly counseled to keep on with conciliation and suggested some form of inquiry while the strike is continuing to reveal who is at the bottom of violating the law and not to attempt any imprisonment at present.
There was some opposition in the cabinet, but strangely not from C.D. Howe, as King somewhat maliciously noted in his diary.
I pointed out that if the government today would make labor work by force, it would create a civil war, if anything of the kind were attempted. Howe, who had been pretty brave some time ago, was pretty silent. I'm far from believing that all the wrong is on one side.
Thus, the Union had already won a victory by forcing the Prime Minister to give voice, if only in his diary, to his fears and misgivings concerning the policy he had allowed his ministers to pursue. The 2,000 men inside Stelco were there to break the strike, and to do that, they had to produce steel. Producing steel did the company no good, however, if it couldn't be shipped. And 4 days after the strike began, picket line violence erupted, which would set the tone for the rest of the strike.
Some of the men in the plant attempted to run a train out of the Stelco main gate. As the shunting engine approached the gate, the pickets were driven back to cover by a hail of bricks hurled out of the darkness behind the engine's powerful headlights.
I saw club-wielding companymen leap from the flatbed cars and start clubbing the strikers. I estimated 300 poured off the flatbed cars. Some had nice new pickaxe handles, which I had seen in the company storeroom. Others had heavy pieces of chain, long iron bolts, pieces of pipe, iron bars, and bricks from the open hut.
The picketers emerged onto the roadway to retrieve the fallen bricks and return fire. The Union phone list was pressed into service. 1,000 men and women were on their way to the gate in 10 minutes. The workers at nearby International Harvester dropped their tools in mid-shift and ran to the aid of their brothers. The train shunted back toward the plant. From then on, there were always lots of volunteer pickets for the night shift. William Kilbourne, historian.
Then the reign of terror started. These fellows were well aware that a lot of men had gone in, and so they started to terrorize their families. For example, someone would phone into the plant and they would ask for Joe, and we would say, "Sorry, he's busy." And the caller would say, "Well, I've got to talk to him, it's urgent. His little son coming home from school was knocked down and killed by a car." That sort of thing. They used to buy 5-gallon pots of the cheapest paint, usually bright green or red, and in the night they would go out and throw it right over the bungalows of these people. As they were going away, they'd throw rocks through the windows. J.P. Kelly.
Probably Ontario has rarely had a more right-wing premier than George Drew. George Drew believed that the CCF was fascist, or that was on Tuesday. On Wednesdays he thought it was communist. But it certainly was totalitarian. He had no doubts about that. And he had really no role in the strike because the labor legislation, because of the War Measures Act, was all federal. What his role could have been was sending in the police, law and order. And he was itching to do that. Or we believed he was itching to do that. But he was stymied by the fact that he could only do that if he was requested to do it by the chief magistrate of the city of Hamilton or the police chief. Now, these two happened to be very close friends and saw eye to eye on virtually everything. The mayor was Sam Lawrence, a Yorkshireman, ardently pro-labor, indeed so pro-labor that he led a parade a day after the strike down to the picket line, and there he proclaimed that if it ever became an issue, he wanted everybody to know that he was a labor man first and a chief magistrate second, which, of course, everyone, all right-thinking people, thought was an outrageous statement. We loved it.
In the totalitarian countries, the first objective of fascist rule has been the crushing of free trade unionism. We in Canada should learn from the history of those countries that the preservation and strength of our unions is essential to the future of our democracy. We all have a stake in the program which labor has embraced for the future of industry in the city of Hamilton. Sam Lawrence.
Larry Sefton was crucial to what happened that summer. A 27-year-old with good looks and a fiery temper, he was brought in by the Steelworkers National Office to oust Tom McClure and the Communist 1005 executives who built the Local and replaced them with CCF types. He did that. He called a strike vote in May, and 3,000 workers voted to strike and only 80 voted against, even though we only had 800 signed-up members. That was what convinced the workers that the strike had majority support. He was the bridge between the moderate Millard, who did the negotiating, and the rank and file. Not everyone liked him, though, and there was lots of friction between him and the more militant heads of the other unions on strike, like the rubber workers and the electrical workers. Eric Hansen.
The scab is a fellow who is mighty yellow, disliked by all the town. Hilton says he's loyal, but you're really going to boil when he finally lets you down.
I was in the engineering department. The people there were not unionized at all. I guess we were open to join the union if we wanted. I never inquired about it. No one ever asked me to join. I stayed in the plant after conferring with 3 friends. Money, I guess, was one factor. We were getting paid triple time. I was getting 60 cents an hour straight. That was damn good money. Dan Robinson.
We ran into a problem of food supplies, but outside of this, we were keeping these men fully entertained. We used to send in boxing shows, movies, and wrestling shows. These men were provided with everything, such as razor blades and toothbrushes. They worked a 48-hour week, but wages were paid for 24 hours a day. Eventually, a lot of students from McMaster went in and worked, and these guys really made a cleanup. So the problem came up about food. And although we tried, people like Canada Packers wouldn't sell us a pound of meat. Here we were, holding the line for industry, and they wouldn't give us one damn thing. People like General Steelwares wouldn't sell us a tin pail. And that strike was practically lost as a result of industry, not by pickets or the union. J.P. Kelly.
Those inside were often prevented from sleeping by the sound of rocks being pelted on the corrugated tin roofs of their barracks, and were continuously leafleted by air to break ranks and come out of the plant, which an estimated 400 did during the strike.
You're already rated as a scab with all that means to you and your family. Staying in the plant will not only lose you your self-respect, you and the company will lose out in this strike. When it's all over, you want to live with the men who had the guts to fight for decent wages. You can if you're prepared to join them in that fight now. Stop being kidded by company stooges. No harm will come to you if you come out of the plant gates. The picket line will let you through to go home to your wife and kids. No one will harm you. Use this pass slip if you want. Give it to the picket captain.
My brother stayed in. I believe he is a bastard for doing it. We take all the risks to get a better workplace, and they make money off our struggle, and eventually we'll get the same benefits we win. That's the way scabs are. John Williams.
While the Toronto Star did a delicate dance between its traditional support for the Liberal Party and its support for organized labor, the Hamilton Spectator, on strike but still printing a stripped-down edition, the Globe and Mail, and the Telegram ran stories about the hardships of inside workers and their families.
The neighborhood children are calling my children scabs, Mrs. Victor Evans said today. Little Marilyn, 8 years old, came to me and asked, "Mommy, what's a scab?" I told her it was just another word for blondie. I am going to send them to their grandmothers. The Telegram.
Now you know you're underpaid, but the boss says you ain't. He speeds up the work till you're about to faint. You may be down and out. If you ain't beaten, pass out a leaflet. Call a meeting, talk it over. Speak your mind. The decide to do something about it.
The night before the strike started, George Washburn and his wife, both Stelco employees and union members, went to work together. Although the strike hadn't yet been called, it was clearly imminent. The Washburns agreed the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift would be their last.
I haven't seen him since. He phoned me on the Sunday from the plant and said I'm staying in. That night, I took the 3 kids down to the Wilcox Gate and we marched in the picket line. I've been picketing my husband ever since.
For the most part, morale on the line was high. Whipper Billy Watson came down and wrestled for the strikers, and Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, strong CIO supporters, came up from the States to perform. A marriage was conducted on the line, but many nights were wet and lonely.
On warm nights, it was different. The line was often good-natured then, as opposed to wary of trouble, even festive. The women and kids from working men's homes nearby would stroll down after supper. They'd sing and cheer a little. The music broadcast from the picket tent rose above their voices in brassy fits and starts. Maclean's Magazine.
I used to go down every morning and make sandwiches. We'd have like an assembly line. There'd be about 4 or 5 of us. You'd make thousands of sandwiches. Ham, cheese, bologna, you know. Mary Fiore.
Some of the women said they could serve spaghetti. It mushroomed. They put out the leaflet, and on Friday nights, there was always the spaghetti dinner, put on with the help of the strikers' wives. But the cooks were Italian. The night Pete Seeger came, the scabs were all out at the Birmingham gate, listening to Pete. And someone said, "Look at the goddamn scabs." And they were applauding and cheering, and Pete began to sing. "If the scabs get in the way, we're going to roll it over them. We're going to roll the union on." And then everybody started to sing the song. Everybody but the scabs.
If the scabs get in the way, we're gonna roll right over them. We're gonna roll right over them. We're gonna roll right over them. If the scabs get in the way, we're gonna roll right over them. We're gonna roll the union on. We're gonna roll. We're gonna roll. We're gonna roll the union on. We're gonna roll. We're gonna roll. We're gonna roll the union on.
People say strikes are won by public opinion. That's not true if what you mean by the public is the whole country. But if you mean your family, your neighbors, your friends, then it's true. In Hamilton, all those people, or the vast majority, said, "You're doing the right thing." And they helped in other ways too. Alex Brown.
I made friends with the Jewish owner of a clothing store, and I was in there when this woman came in and asked if he carried long underwear. And he said he did, and he took down a box while she went on talking, saying that was great because her husband was inside Stelco and was cold at night. My friend, the owner, without saying a word, put the underwear back in its box and put it away until she saw what he was doing and stopped talking. Then he said, "I don't sell to scabs." Eric Hansen.
Strike fever had gripped the city of Hamilton. Westinghouse and Firestone and the Spectator were already on strike. With other plant closings due to a lack of steel, 2 in 5 of Hamilton's workers were now either on strike or laid off as a result of it. Nora Frances Henderson, a small, determined conservative city councilor, now emerged as the chief spokesman of law and order, since Mayor Lawrence, as she and many others saw it, had defaulted on this responsibility.
My fellow citizens, nearly 3,000 workers have been besieged in the Steel Company of Canada plant in this city for the past 3 weeks and are unable to go to and from their homes and families. This is violation of so fundamental a right that it constitutes something very nearly approaching anarchy in our city. It is a matter of public knowledge and rising concern, as well as of police court record, that a number of Stelco employees who have got out to go to their homes and families for a few hours have been brutally molested and prevented by gangster picketers from returning to work.
Nora Frances Henderson then announced she would exercise her free right to go in and out of the plant. The steelworkers knew better than to try and stop her.
Her tiny figure against the wide expanse of pavement made a dramatic picture that was placarded across the nation's newspapers, a symbol of the right of all citizens to go about their lawful business free and unmolested. William Kilbourne, historian.
Incidents continued on the picket lines. Commando units were formed on both sides to sabotage the other. Railway workers refused to take any materials in or out of the plant, and violence erupted when trucks took their place. By the first week of August, Nora Henderson succeeded in calling for a special meeting of council to debate policing, hoping to have Mounties and OPP brought in to augment the Hamilton police, whose loyalty she believed was in question. On August 8th, the Labour Progressive Party, as the Communist Party was called, and other militant left-wingers and their union supporters held a large rally in Woodlands Park and whipped up enough fervor to ensure a massive crowd outside City Hall the next evening. Inside the meeting, Mayor Lawrence held sway, with Chief Crocker insisting Hamilton police could handle matters. Outside, the crowd of 4,000 sang, "We'll hang Nora Henderson from a sour apple tree." When Henderson emerged, a near riot developed as the crowd jostled her car with her in it, almost overturning it before police stepped in and order was restored. The nation's media interpreted the incident as a sign that things were getting out of hand in Hamilton, despite the mayor's assurances. What Henderson described as jungle law seemed to have the upper hand.
It is impossible to indict the mob which used violence on Councillor Nora Frances Henderson without indicting Mayor Sam Lawrence. His has been a singularly degrading performance. Worse by far, however, has been the part played by the federal government, in defiance of whose emergency order the strike was called. Before all others, the federal cabinet must accept responsibility for the near anarchy Councillor Henderson proved exists in Hamilton. The Globe and Mail.
Rattled by the near-explosive violence that had taken place outside City Hall and fearing outside police intervention, Larry Sefton guaranteed council that those inside could move in and out of the plant freely, a decision deplored by the militants and many rank-and-file strikers. Sefton and Bill Walsh, the communist leader of the electrical workers on strike at Westinghouse, left the council meeting together.
I was furious. Selling out your own strike is one thing, I said to Sefton, but you're trying to sell us out as well. Bill Walsh.
Sefton himself wasn't happy with opening the line, but felt public opinion had forced his hand. His change of heart was short-lived.
Scabs and trucks were driving through the line, so I persuaded Charlie Millard to go on the radio and tell all the pickets to be down at the plant gates. And by 1 o'clock, there were guys down there by the hundreds. So a truck comes down, and everyone grabs it, and over she went. It was a dairy truck bringing the picketers' milk, but we didn't care. The next truck that came along was a big Imperial oil tanker, and he couldn't get by the dairy truck we turned over. That stopped them for a while. We had to do that sort of thing, or they would have busted our union wide open. George Martin.
After that incident, the union decided to once more close the line and take its chances with public opinion. The line went back up. The fighting was back on. 2 days later, council voted to ask for OPP and RCMP support to control the pickets. When people learned that outside police were coming, the response was swift and negative. A march of 15,000, many of them veterans in uniform, the entire Studebaker workforce, as well as ordinary citizens, wound its way through Hamilton in protest against the police arrival.
Today, a long line of war veterans, mostly servicemen in the Second Great War, came down the street headed by a sound truck, playing marching songs. They carried placards with statements like, "We vets are in the Union Army now." There were many hundreds in their ranks. Women cheered and some cried with excitement. Two girls from an adjoining plant walked down the road and stepped into the picket line. A little boy broke away from his mother, rushed up and took his dad's hand and walked solemnly in the shuffling circle. At the time, the dread expectation hung over the scene that the outside police were coming. Nobody wanted the police to come, it seemed, yet everyone was ready. Globe and Mail.
When the police came, 250 OPP and an equal number of RCMP, the entire kitchen staff and cleaning staff at the barracks they were posted to walked off the job rather than serve them. The police were then sent to the Army Veterans Vocational Training School to stay. But the veterans who staffed the school also marched out and joined the picket line in protest. Seeing that sort of public antipathy to the use of outside police, they were never ordered into service. It was thus the attitude of veterans in and out of the Union that kept the police in their barracks. Inside the plant, restless anti-strikers were asking, when do we get out?
As you know, for almost 7 weeks, almost 2,000 law-abiding citizens of Canada have been deprived of their primary rights by mass picketing of the plant by the United Steelworkers of America, although the plant is operating in compliance with an order in council. We believe we're justified in asking you for a prompt and definite statement as to how soon our rights will be restored.
Joseph M. Pigott, president and founder of Pigott Construction, wrote to his friend C.D. Howe.
I don't suppose there's anything I can say to you regarding the steel strike that will add one atom to the information you already possess. But I've been very worried this week about the consequences of the steel strike on construction. I've only to mention nails, wire, reinforcing bars, sheet plate, wire lays, the scarcity of which is well known. In the meantime, there is a certain amount of steel being produced, particularly at Stelco. Whatever means are required to bring out such products should be taken. We are worried and discouraged, and you are the one we naturally turn to, for reasons I need not go into. J.M. Pigott.
C.D. Howe's reply made the political case for government inaction and asked for the support of industry in his efforts to hold the line and to avoid what he saw as an even greater danger.
Dear Joe, there are indications that industry is not behind the government, and if this is the case, our efforts cannot succeed. If we were to send an army into Hamilton to open the picket lines, past experience tells us that a net effect would be to place a number of labor leaders in a position to succeed in campaigns as members of Parliament. I believe the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919 produced 6 labor leaders who became MPs. We must wait it out, and I sincerely hope we will have the support of industry in doing so. C.D. Howe.
The Canadian Congress of Labour had sent King a telegram asking the government to impose compulsory arbitration on the company. As well, Cardinal McQuiggan, Archbishop of Toronto, wrote a letter to Secretary of State Paul Martin, which was read to Cabinet.
Public sympathy seems to belong with the strikers. So at the next civic election, no matter how the strike ends, the vote will go to Sam Lawrence and the councillors who have been pro-strike. If the way the strike ends discredits the so-called moderate leaders and puts the communists in the driver's seat, the whole working class vote may be permanently captured by the LPP, the Communist Party. It might be good government policy to allow some face saving for the union, which has already backed down considerably from its original demand for 19.5 cents an hour. Cardinal McGuigan.
King's response was a gem of Kingian avoidance and manipulation. He quietly told Labor Minister Mitchell to tell Stelco to arbitrate, but he kept the Congress of Labor in the dark.
I indicated the government would recommend arbitration in order that the public would know who were not right and who were not wrong. I also stated we would withdraw the order in council appointing the controller.
So what King did, typical King style, Thomas Raleigh was the CEO of the Canada Cement Company, and he asked him to have a talk with Millard, right out of the loop. And what Raleigh, so that this meeting became the meeting at which King was giving Millard an opportunity to say things to Raleigh which were reassuring. And it's a fascinating insight into King because he didn't know that that's what would happen. But of course it was a private meeting, so if it didn't happen, no one would ever know about it. Meanwhile, King was telling C.D. Howe that he was going to insist on arbitration. And so C.D. Howe was running off to Stelco and saying, you better come up, you better be willing to settle. King is going to force arbitration on you, and you'll end up with union security. Meanwhile, King was telling the Canadian Congress of Labor that he didn't know whether he could arbitrate, that this was a ministerial thing. That he was. So on the one hand, he was trying to spook the company while he kept the labor off with one hand. And his third ploy was to try to have Millard say to this captain of industry, Thomas Raleigh, look, I'm not that bad. And that's exactly what happened.
Tom Raleigh looked at me and he said, Charlie, do you believe in socialism? And I said, with all my heart. But I'm still a Democrat. And I don't think we'll see socialism in Canada in my day. Well, he said, that's an honest thing. He says, do you know that that is one of the reasons why you can't settle the steel strike? They're afraid that if the steel workers get a foothold in the Stelco plant, they will gradually take over the plant under the CCF.
Within 2 days of Millard's discussions with Thomas Raleigh, a settlement was reached. After an 86-day strike, the union won only 3.5 cents more than the company had originally offered, plus 2 weeks vacation after 5 years. But along with that came a formula which provided for union security, the basic union demand. Hilton and the steel company did not lose gracefully.
The news that striking steelworkers have voted to end the strike called by them on July the 14th will be a relief to all. Canada should have enjoyed a summer of unparalleled production. Instead, the strikes called by the CIO unions have produced 3 months or more of frustration and loss. Hugh Hilton.
What happens when you have a dispute like that? When half the employees work and half are on strike? What happened at Stelco was that when the strike was all settled, everybody joined the union. J.P. Kelly.
It was the spirit of Hamilton, the lunch bucket city, that had proved decisive. In the end, what Mackenzie King and C.D. Howe and Hilton and Millard and Kelly thought and did had had less impact than the sentiments of an industrial working class conditioned by depression and war.
It isn't the pay increases or even the dues checkoff that I most remember, but the benefits which could not be measured in dollars and cents. It's the memory of that first day on the picket line. I feel it yet. The feeling of freedom that we all felt by breaking the hold that Stelco had on us. And above all, that we grew to conquer our own fears. Reg Gardner.
The strike at Hamilton determined that the union movement would be part of Canada's next period of industrial growth, though few anticipated how rapid that would be. The strike had been settled because business across Canada decided to pay the price of labor peace so it could get on with the job of satisfying the appetites of the post-war world. Mrs. Washburn, who'd picketed her husband George because he'd stayed inside Stelco, eventually saw him emerge.
They finally let George out of the plant when the strike ended, but I never did let him back into the house.
In the final analysis, the Hamilton strike was an attempt to snatch from the war something of lasting significance here at home in Canada. It struck a deeper need. It wasn't just a strike. It was working people staking their claim after 16 years of depression and war when no one's life was their own. Eric Hansen.
From all of you good workers, good news to you I'll tell of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Which side are you on? Which side are
Tonight on JAG, Harm questions a captain's training methods. That's coming up next right here on TV.
And I'll stick with the Union till every battle's won. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Don't scab for the bosses, don't listen to their lies. Us poor folks haven't got a chance unless we organize. Which side are you on?